The rain came down so hard that Mark Hensley could barely see the road in front of him. Lightning cracked across the sky, and for one bright second, the empty field beside the highway looked like daylight. He pulled his jacket tighter and kept running toward the old concrete building he had spotted from the car. His friends were still parked half a mile back, laughing about how he always chased storms like a fool. He did not care. This storm felt different. The clouds above the field were spinning in a slow, tight circle, and the air smelled like burnt metal. He reached the building and pushed open a rusted door that should not have moved so easily. Inside, everything was dry and silent, which made no sense after the storm outside. The walls were smooth and gray, without a single window. A soft blue light traced a path along the floor, almost like it was inviting him to walk further in. Mark told himself he would take one look and leave. He told himself a lot of things that night that turned out to be wrong. The hallway ended in a round room, with a single metal chair bolted to the floor. Above the chair, a thin beam of light scanned down from the ceiling, moving in slow, careful lines. Mark stepped closer, curious despite the tight feeling building in his chest. The moment his shadow crossed the beam, the light turned bright green, and a calm voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Candidate located. Enlistment confirmed. Welcome to the 3rd Auxiliary Unit." Mark froze. He tried to ask what that meant, but his voice came out as a whisper that no one answered. The floor beneath him shifted, not shaking, just sliding smoothly to one side, like a hidden door opening under his feet. He grabbed for the chair, but his hand passed through nothing solid. The last thing he saw in that building was the blue light folding in on itself, and then there was no building at all, only stars. When Mark opened his eyes again, he was lying on a cold metal floor that hummed gently beneath him, like a large engine working somewhere far below. He sat up fast, his head spinning, and looked down at himself. He was not wearing his soaked jacket and jeans anymore. Instead, he had on a fitted gray uniform, with a strange emblem stitched over the chest, 3 curved lines wrapped around a circle. He did not remember changing his clothes. He did not remember much of anything after the blue light. The room around him was long and narrow, lined with rows of metal bunks bolted to the walls. A window at the far end showed a view that made his stomach drop. Outside was not sky, outside was black space, filled with more stars than he had ever seen in his life, and a curved shape in the distance that could only be a planet, though it was not one he recognized. He was not on Earth anymore. He was not even close. Mark stumbled toward the window, pressing his hand against the cold glass, half hoping it was a trick, a dream, anything that made more sense than this. Behind him, a door slid open with a soft hiss, and someone stepped inside. Mark spun around, ready to explain himself, to say there had been some kind of mistake, but the figure standing in the doorway was not human. She stood taller than Mark, with pale green skin that shimmered faintly under the ship's lights, and eyes that were a deep gold color, split by a narrow black line down the center. She wore the same gray uniform as him, though hers fit like she had worn 100 just like it before. She studied him for a long moment, tilting her head slightly, the way someone might look at a puzzle piece that did not belong in the box. "You are the new one," she said. Her voice was steady, careful, with an accent Mark could not place. "The scanner marked you as enlisted 3 hours ago. I am Ith. I lead this squad." Mark opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "There has been a mistake," he said. "I was just walking. I found a building. I did not sign up for anything." Ith's expression did not change, but something behind her golden eyes seemed to sharpen. "The recruitment beacon does not make mistakes," she said. "It only accepts those who meet the requirements. If it marked you, then you meet them, whether you understand why or not." Mark felt his knees weaken, and he sat down hard on the edge of the nearest bunk. None of this felt real, yet the cold metal under his hands and the low hum of the ship's engine were far too solid to be a dream. He thought of his friends back on Earth, waiting in the car, wondering where he had gone. He thought about how his mother would call his phone tonight and get no answer. "What is this place?" he finally managed to ask. "What did I just join?" Ith walked further into the room and sat across from him, resting her elbows on her knees. "This is the 3rd Auxiliary Unit," she said, "part of a larger coalition that protects settled worlds from a threat called the Voss. We are not soldiers by choice alone. Some of us were born into this duty. Others, like you, were chosen by the beacon for reasons the Coalition does not always explain to us. Mark's mind raced through everything he had heard about aliens growing up, none of which had prepared him for a calm woman with green skin, explaining that he was now part of a war he knew nothing about. He wanted to laugh, or maybe scream, but instead he just asked the only question that made any sense to him. "Can I go home?" Ayeth was quiet for a moment. "Enlistment is binding under Coalition law," she said carefully. "Once the beacon marks a candidate, the process cannot be reversed by simple request. There may be paths to release later, but I have not seen one used in my time here. For now, you are part of this squad, and the squad depends on every member pulling their weight." The words landed on Mark like a physical weight. He looked around the small room again, at the empty bunks waiting to be filled, at the strange stars outside the window, and felt something inside him go very still and very cold. This was not a dream he could wake up from. This was his life now, whether he understood the rules or not. Ayeth stood and offered a hand to help him up, which surprised him more than anything else that had happened so far. Small kindness felt out of place among so much confusion. He took it, and her grip was firm and sure. "Come," she said. "The others will want to meet you, and you will want food before the shift begins. Whatever questions you have, ask them as we walk. Standing still will not make this easier to understand." Mark followed her out of the room, his legs unsteady beneath him, his mind still trying to catch up with everything that had happened in what felt like only a few minutes. The corridor outside stretched long and curved gently, following the shape of the ship itself. Every few steps, another door led to a room he could not begin to guess the purpose of, filled with humming machines or glowing panels, covered in symbols he did not recognize. As they walked, Ayeth explained the basics in short, clear sentences, the way someone might explain the rules of a game to a child who had wandered into the middle of it. The ship was called the Halvan Ridge, one of many transport and training vessels the Coalition used to move new recruits toward active postings. Their squad numbered 6, including Mark now, and they were currently 3 days out from a training station where he would begin to learn the skills every soldier in the unit needed to survive. "Survive what?" Mark asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "The Voss," Ayeth said simply. "You will learn more when it matters. For now, focus on what is in front of you." They reached a wider room filled with long tables and the quiet sound of conversation in several different languages at once. A handful of beings sat scattered around the space, some clearly alien, one who looked almost entirely human except for faintly glowing veins along his forearms. Every head turned when Mark walked in, and the conversation died away into curious silence. "This is Mark," Ayeth announced to the room. "He is our newest member. Beacon enlisted 3 hours ago." A murmur passed through the group, and Mark caught a few glances that felt less than welcoming. The human-looking man with glowing veins leaned back in his chair and studied Mark with narrowed eyes. "Another one," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "That makes 2 from that little blue planet in the last cycle. Something is changing." Ayeth shot him a warning look, sharp enough that he raised both hands and said nothing more. Mark filed the comment away in his mind, another piece of a puzzle he did not yet have enough pieces to understand. 2 from that little blue planet. He was not the only human ever taken. Someone else from Earth had been here before him. Ayeth guided him to an empty seat and set a tray of unfamiliar food in front of him, food that smelled faintly of something between bread and citrus. "Eat," she said. "Tomorrow the real work begins, and you will need your strength." Mark looked down at the tray, then around the room, at the strange faces watching him with a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. Somewhere far behind him, Earth was spinning through its ordinary night, his friends probably still waiting by the car, wondering where he had gone. He picked up the strange food with a shaking hand and forced himself to eat, because whatever this new life was, he had a feeling he would need every bit of strength he could find to survive it. Outside the small window at the end of the room, the stars slid slowly past, as the ship carried him further from everything he had ever known, and closer to a war he had never asked to join. Later that night, if night meant anything on a ship that never grew dark, Mark lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of the strangers around him. Somewhere in his chest, fear had settled into something steadier, something closer to determination. He did not know why the beacon had chosen him, or who the other human from Earth might be, or what waited for him on the training station 3 days away. But he knew one thing clearly: the kind of clarity that only comes after the worst has already happened. Whatever this new life demanded of him, he would learn it, because giving up was no longer an option written into his story. As the ship carried him deeper into the dark, Mark closed his eyes and let the steady hum of the engines lull him toward a sleep filled with strange new dreams. A loud horn tore Mark out of sleep before his eyes had even opened. For a moment he forgot where he was, and his hand reached out for a nightstand that was not there. Then the cold metal of the bunk beneath him reminded him everything from the night before had been real. Around him, the other squad members were already moving, pulling on gear with the ease of people who had done this 100 times before. Ayeth stood at the end of the room, arms crossed, watching him, with an expression that told him he had exactly 1 minute to catch up. "We landed at the training station an hour ago," she said. "You slept through docking. Get dressed. First session starts now, not later." Mark scrambled out of the bunk, pulling on the uniform someone had left folded at the foot of his bed. His hands fumbled with straps he did not understand, and he ended up following the lead of the human-looking man with glowing veins, whose name he learned was Nathan Cole, the very same second human the others had mentioned the day before. Nathan gave him a quick, tired smile as he adjusted the last strap on Mark's chest plate. "Welcome to the club nobody wanted to join," Nathan said quietly. "It gets easier. Not easy, just easier." They filed out of the ship into a massive open hangar, built into the side of a rocky gray moon. The gravity here felt slightly heavier than Earth's, pressing down on Mark's shoulders in a way that made every step feel like wading through water. Rows of other recruits from different squads stood in loose formation nearby, a strange mix of species Mark could not begin to name. Some had 4 arms. Some had no visible eyes at all, yet still seemed to watch him closely as he passed. A booming voice echoed across the hangar, calling all new squads to the central training yard. Ayeth led their group at a brisk pace, and Mark hurried to keep up, his heart pounding from more than just the effort. The training yard turned out to be an enormous open field, surrounded by tall metal towers, each one lined with strange devices that hummed with barely contained energy. A broad-shouldered alien, with rough, stone-colored skin, stood at the front of the group, addressing the recruits in a flat, commanding tone. He introduced himself as Instructor Doran, and he wasted no time on kind words or gentle introductions. "Today you learn to survive," he announced. "Tomorrow you learn to fight. Whether you live long enough to matter after that depends entirely on how well you listen right now." The first lesson had nothing to do with weapons at all. Instead, Doran walked the recruits through the basics of the ship's gravity systems, explaining how combat on different worlds could mean fighting in conditions 3 times heavier than what most bodies were built for, or so light that a careless jump could send a soldier drifting helplessly into open space. Mark found himself struggling to keep his footing, even during simple drills, his body constantly fighting against gravity that never behaved the way it should. Kate Wren, another member of their squad, a quiet woman with short auburn hair and calm, watchful eyes, noticed his struggle and fell into step beside him during a short break. She had been with the unit for almost 2 years, she explained, ever since a research accident on a distant colony left her stranded, until the Coalition found her and offered her a place among their ranks. "It gets into your bones eventually," she said, glancing at Mark's unsteady stance. "Your body starts remembering the shifts before your mind even notices them. Give it a few weeks." A few weeks felt like a lifetime away, when Mark could barely stay upright, but her words settled something anxious in his chest anyway. He was not the only one who had once stood exactly where he stood now, confused and afraid. Somehow, people found a way through it. He would have to as well. The days that followed blurred together into a steady rhythm of exhausting drills. Mornings began with movement training, learning to control his body under gravity, that shifted without warning between sessions. Afternoons focused on the strange weapons the Coalition issued to its soldiers, devices that fired concentrated bursts of light rather than anything resembling a bullet, controlled entirely by small sensors embedded in the user's palm. Mark's aim was terrible at first, his shots scattering wildly across the practice range, while more experienced recruits hit their marks with careless precision. Ayeth oversaw much of his individual training herself, correcting his stance with patient, exacting instructions. She rarely offered praise, but she never mocked his mistakes either, simply guiding him back to the correct form again and again, until his muscles began to understand what his mind still struggled to grasp. Slowly, painfully, Mark began to improve. It was during a rare quiet moment, sitting on a low wall at the edge of the training yard while the twin suns of the moon dipped toward the horizon, that Mark finally worked up the courage to ask Ayeth the question that had been circling his thoughts since the first day. "Why does the beacon choose humans at all?" he asked. "Nathan mentioned I was the second one recently. That cannot be a coincidence." Ayeth was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes fixed on the horizon rather than on him. "I do not know the full answer," she admitted finally. "The beacon's selection process is managed by a separate branch of the coalition, one that does not share its reasoning with field officers like me. What I do know is that humans have begun appearing in recruitment records more frequently over the last several cycles. Before that, your world was rarely touched at all." Mark turned that over in his mind, uneasy. "Why now?" he pressed. "What changed?" "I have asked the same question," Ayeth said, and received no satisfying answer. "Some believe the coalition is testing something, though no one has confirmed what that something might be. I would advise you not to dwell on it too long. Questions like that have a way of drawing unwanted attention from people far above my rank." Something in her tone told Mark this was not idle caution. There was a warning tucked inside her words, subtle but unmistakable, and he decided not to push the subject further, at least not yet. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, watching the strange twin suns sink lower, until the sky turned a deep shade of violet he had never seen above any field back home. Over the following days, Mark grew steadily closer to the rest of his squad, even as the training grew harder. Simon Ashford, a lean, quick-witted alien with pale blue skin, took it upon himself to teach Mark the finer points of hand-to-hand defense, laughing more often than any instructor Mark had encountered so far, though his lessons were no less demanding for the humor woven through them. Grace Doyle, the squad's pilot, spent her evenings showing Mark diagrams of the ship's systems, insisting that every soldier needed to understand how to fly, even badly, in case the moment ever came when no one else was left to do it. Slowly, painfully, the pieces of this strange new life began to fit together. Mark learned to read the subtle signs of shifting gravity before his body reacted to them. He learned to steady his aim until his shots landed close enough to the target to earn a rare nod of approval from Ayeth. He learned the names and quirks of his squadmates, and in turn, they began to trust him with small responsibilities, the kind that meant nothing on their own, but added up, day by day, into something that almost felt like belonging. Yet beneath the growing routine, an uneasy thread remained tangled in the back of Mark's mind. Nathan's comment about a second recruit, Ayeth's careful, guarded answers, the warning buried inside her advice not to ask too many questions. Something larger sat behind his sudden arrival in this world, something the coalition was not eager to explain, and Mark could not shake the feeling that sooner or later he would have to find out what it was, whether anyone wanted him to or not. Midway through the training cycle, Doran introduced a new kind of exercise, one that replaced the open field with a sealed chamber lined with projectors on every wall. The chamber, he explained, could recreate the sights and sounds of an actual battlefield with startling accuracy, allowing recruits to face something close to real combat, without the real danger of dying from their mistakes. Mark stepped inside for his first simulation with his stomach already twisted into knots, unsure what to expect. The room dissolved around him, replaced by the image of a rocky canyon under a sickly orange sky. Shapes moved in the distance, low and fast, their outlines flickering strangely as they closed in. Mark's training kicked in without him fully deciding to act, his feet finding cover behind a jagged outcrop, just as a burst of simulated light streaked past where he had been standing a second earlier. His hands shook as he raised his weapon, but his aim, thanks to weeks of patient correction, held steadier than he expected. When the simulation ended and the canyon dissolved back into gray walls, Mark realized his shirt was soaked through with sweat, his heart still pounding, as if the danger had been real. Ayeth, watching from a raised platform at the edge of the chamber, gave him the smallest nod of approval, before moving on to critique the next recruit in line. It was not much, but after weeks of careful correction and quiet patience, that small nod felt like the greatest compliment Mark had ever received. That night, unable to sleep, Mark found Nathan sitting alone near the edge of the hangar, staring out at the stars scattered across the dark sky. Mark hesitated before sitting down beside him, uncertain whether Nathan wanted company or silence. After a long pause, Nathan spoke first, his voice quieter than Mark had heard it before. "I was taken almost a year ago," Nathan said, not looking away from the stars. "Different beacon site, somewhere outside a small town in England. I remember thinking the exact same thing you probably thought, that it had to be some kind of mistake, that someone would come explain everything and send me home. Nobody ever did." Mark listened, unsure what comfort he could offer someone who had already lived through a full year of the same confusion still tangled inside his own chest. "Do you think we will ever go back?" he finally asked. Nathan was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I used to think about it every single day," he admitted. "Now I think about it maybe once a week. That is not because I stopped caring. It is because staying alive out here takes up most of the space in your head that used to be reserved for missing home. Mark, listen to me. Whatever this place demands from you, give it everything you have. The recruits who hold back, who spend all their energy wishing they were somewhere else, they are the ones who struggle the most when the real fighting starts." The advice settled heavily in Mark's chest, but he recognized the truth buried inside it. He thought of his unsteady aim slowly sharpening under Ayeth's patient correction, of his footing growing surer with every gravity drill, of the small, hard-won nod she had given him only hours earlier. Progress, however slow, was still progress, and it was the only thing standing between him and being left completely helpless when danger finally arrived for real. Over the final days of training, Mark pushed himself harder than he ever had before, driven now by more than just fear. He wanted to earn his place among people who had shown him more patience and honesty than he expected from strangers, thrown together by an unexplained twist of fate. Slowly, his squad mates began treating him less like an outsider dragged in by accident, and more like someone who genuinely belonged among them, someone whose presence they were beginning to trust in ways that mattered. On the final evening of the training cycle, Doran gathered all the new recruits back into the central yard. His stone-colored face, unusually solemn under the fading light of the twin suns. "Training is finished," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent field. "Tomorrow, deployment orders arrive for every squad present. Some of you will see combat within the week. Use tonight to rest, because rest may be a luxury you do not have again for some time." A heavy silence settled over the recruits as the weight of his words sank in. Mark glanced sideways at Ayeth, who stood with her jaw set and her eyes fixed straight ahead, already bracing for whatever came next. Beside her, Nathan let out a slow breath, and Kate reached over to squeeze Grace's shoulder in quiet support. Even Simon's usual easy humor had faded into something more serious. Mark realized, standing there under the strange violet sky, that everything he had learned over the past days was no longer theory. Whatever waited for them next would test all of it, and there would be no gentle instructor standing by to correct his mistakes if he faltered. As the recruits dispersed toward their quarters for one last night of uneasy rest, Mark found himself staring up at the unfamiliar stars, wondering which one might be hiding the battle that would decide whether he lived to ask his unanswered questions at all. The alarm came before dawn, a sharp, insistent pulse of red light sweeping across every wall of the ship. Mark was on his feet before he was fully awake, his body reacting to weeks of drilled instinct even as his mind scrambled to catch up. Around him, the rest of the squad moved with the same urgency, pulling on gear in practiced silence. Ayeth's voice cut through the noise, calm, but edged with something sharper than usual. "Deployment orders arrived early," she said. "A mining colony on the third moon of this system has requested emergency support. Voss scouts were spotted near the perimeter 3 hours ago. We leave within the hour." The word Voss landed in the room like a physical weight. Until now, the enemy had existed only as a name mentioned in warnings, a shape described in training briefings, never something Mark had actually seen. Now, within the hour, he would be facing them for real, with weapons he had only recently learned to aim, and a body still not entirely used to gravity that refused to behave. The transport ship dropped through the moon's thin atmosphere faster than felt safe, shaking hard enough that Mark gripped the straps of his seat until his knuckles ached. Through the small window beside him, he caught his first glimpse of the mining colony, a scattered cluster of domed structures, connected by narrow tunnels, ringed by tall defensive walls that already showed scorched black marks along their upper edges. Beyond the walls, the gray landscape stretched out in jagged ridges and deep craters, offering countless places for an enemy to hide. They landed hard just inside the colony's outer wall, and the moment the ship's doors opened, the sound of distant weapons fire reached Mark's ears for the first time. Sharp cracks of light striking stone somewhere beyond the ridgeline. His squad moved out fast, spreading into the formation they had drilled 100 times in the safety of the simulation chamber. This time, there was no safety net waiting to catch his mistakes. Grace stayed close to the ship, keeping its systems ready for a fast retreat if needed, while Ayeth led the rest of the squad toward the colony's command center, where a handful of exhausted defenders had been holding the line since the first attack began. Kate moved at Mark's side, her weapon steady, her eyes constantly scanning the ridges above them for movement. "They are testing the walls, not attacking directly yet," Kate said quietly as they advanced. "Small groups, checking for weaknesses. That usually means a larger force is close behind." The words had barely left her mouth when the first Voss scout appeared, dropping down from a ridge above them with unnerving speed. Mark's breath caught in his throat at the sight of it, a lean, dark shape that moved with too many joints, its limbs bending in ways that made his mind recoil, even as his training pushed his hands to raise his weapon. He fired without fully deciding to, and the scout twisted aside with impossible speed, dodging the shot easily, before Simon's follow-up strike forced it to retreat back over the ridge. "That is what they do," Simon said, breathing hard as he reloaded. Their systems read patterns. Predictable movement, predictable timing. They dodge it before you even finish the motion. Mark filed the warning away, his heart hammering, and kept moving forward with the rest of the squad toward the command center. Along the way, they passed colony workers huddled in shelters, frightened faces watching the soldiers pass with a mixture of hope and desperation. One young woman, introduced quickly as Laura Whitfield, the colony's junior engineer, rushed out to meet Ayeth with urgent news. "The main defense grid is failing," Laura said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We can reroute power from the east generator, but someone will need to hold that section long enough for the technicians to finish the repair. If the Voss break through before then, the whole colony loses its shields." Ayeth did not hesitate. She split the squad without a moment's pause, sending Simon and Kate toward the command center to assist the remaining defenders, while she, Mark, and Nathan pushed east toward the generator Laura had described. The decision left little room for protest, and Mark found himself moving alongside Ayeth and Nathan through narrow service tunnels that echoed with the growing sound of distant weapons fire. The east generator sat inside a squat, reinforced building at the edge of the colony, already surrounded by a handful of exhausted technicians working frantically to reroute the failing systems. Ayeth positioned Mark and Nathan at the two entrances leading into the building, instructing them to hold the position no matter what happened inside. Mark took his post at the northern entrance, his weapon raised, his whole body thrumming with adrenaline, as the sounds of fighting grew steadily louder in the distance. It did not take long for the first wave to arrive. A group of Voss soldiers, larger and more coordinated than the lone scout from before, surged over the ridge above the generator building, moving in a tight, eerily synchronized formation. Mark's training screamed at him to fall into the same predictable rhythm he had drilled 100 times, but something in the back of his mind, some instinct born from years of playing sports and reacting on impulse back on Earth, told him to break the pattern instead. Instead of firing in the steady, even bursts his training emphasized, Mark shifted his weight suddenly, firing off rhythm, moving sideways in short bursts that had no clear pattern at all. The effect was immediate and startling. Two of the advancing Voss soldiers hesitated, their movements stuttering as if their targeting systems could not decide how to respond to motion that refused to follow any predictable shape. The brief hesitation gave Nathan the opening he needed to land a decisive strike, forcing the group to scatter and regroup at a safer distance. Ayeth, emerging briefly from the generator building to check their position, caught the tail end of the exchange and studied Mark with sharp, calculating eyes. "Your movements confused them," she said quickly. "Their systems read pattern and probability. Human instinct does not always follow either. Keep doing exactly what you just did." The realization gave Mark a strange, fierce confidence he had not expected to feel in the middle of a fight for his life. For the first time since the beacon had pulled him away from everything familiar, being human, being unpredictable in a way trained soldiers were not, felt like an advantage rather than a weakness. He held his position through wave after wave of attacks, his movements deliberately erratic, buying crucial seconds each time the Voss soldiers' formations broke apart in confusion. While Mark, Iath, and Nathan held the generator, the fight at the command center had grown far worse than any of them realized in the moment. Simon and Kate arrived to find the remaining colony defenders pinned down behind a low barricade, unable to advance or retreat as a second, larger wave of Voss soldiers pressed in from two directions at once. Kate later described it to Mark in short, clipped sentences, the kind of description someone gives when they are still too close to an event to relive it in full detail. "They had us boxed in," she said. Simon climbed onto the barricade itself to draw their attention toward him, giving the rest of us a narrow window to reposition. It worked, but it cost us. 2 soldiers from the neighboring squad went down covering that same window. Simon does not know that part yet. I have not found the right moment to tell him. Back at the generator, Mark had no way of knowing any of this was happening at the same time. His entire focus narrowed down to the ridge above him, and the shifting shapes of Voss soldiers testing his position again and again. Each wave grew slightly more cautious than the last, as if word of his unpredictable movements had somehow spread through whatever strange, connected awareness linked the Voss soldiers together. Nathan noticed the shift too, calling it out between exchanges of fire. "They are adjusting!" he shouted over the noise, watching each other's mistakes. "We need to keep moving, keep breaking the pattern, or they will figure out how to counter it." Mark forced his exhausted legs to keep shifting, keep dodging in directions that made no logical sense even to himself, trusting that whatever confused the Voss targeting systems was worth the strain on his own aching body. Beside him, Iath fought with a controlled, efficient grace that came from years of experience, covering the gaps Mark's unpredictable movements sometimes left open. Together, the 3 of them held the generator building through wave after wave, until finally, the attacks began to thin, then stopped altogether, as the last Voss forces pulled back over the ridge, under the newly restored defense shields glowing faintly overhead. At some point, word reached them that Simon and Kate had successfully held the command center, though not without cost. When the fighting finally began to ease, as the last remaining Voss forces retreated back over the ridge under the newly restored defense shields, Mark sank against the wall of the generator building, his whole body trembling with exhaustion. It was only later, gathering with the rest of the squad near the ship as Grace prepared it for departure, that the full weight of the day settled over them. 2 soldiers from a neighboring squad, ones Mark had exchanged only a few words with during training, had not made it through the fighting near the command center. Kate stood apart from the others, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the colony's walls, mourning people Mark had barely known but whose loss still pressed heavily on everyone around him. Laura approached the group before they boarded the ship, her earlier panic replaced now with quiet, exhausted gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, looking between them. "I do not know what would have happened without you." As she turned to leave, something in her expression shifted, a flicker of hesitation, as if she wanted to say more, but was unsure whether she should. Mark noticed it and, driven by an instinct he could not fully explain, called out to stop her before she disappeared back toward the colony shelters. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Laura glanced around quickly before lowering her voice. "There was a data request that came through our systems 2 days before the attack began," she admitted. "A search through Coalition personnel records, flagged under a name I did not recognize until I saw the emblem on your uniform just now. It matched your unit's registry number. I assumed it was standard deployment preparation, but it happened before anyone knew an attack was coming." Mark felt a cold, uneasy weight settle in his stomach. "Do you still have that record?" he asked. Laura hesitated, glancing back toward the colony, as if worried someone might be listening. "I can pull it before you leave," she said quietly. "But whoever requested it used clearance high enough that most people in my position never even see it exist." Shawaeth, standing close enough to overhear the exchange, turned toward Mark with an unreadable expression, her earlier calm now edged with something closer to concern. "Get the record," she said to Laura, her voice low and urgent. Quickly, before the ship departs. Nathan, standing close enough to catch the tail end of the conversation, stepped forward with a troubled expression, memories of his own arrival clearly stirring behind his eyes. My beacon site was near a small research post, he said slowly, thinking back. I always assumed it was chance that I stumbled onto it during a hiking trip. Nobody ever suggested it might have been chosen for me instead of the other way around. Ayeth's gaze moved between the two of them, her expression carefully neutral, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed how seriously she was taking the possibility. If someone within the coalition has been directing the beacon toward specific candidates on your world, she said quietly, that would explain far more than a simple rise in enlistment numbers. It would mean the process is not random selection at all, but deliberate recruitment disguised as accident. The colony around them had grown quieter as evening settled over the ridges, the last echoes of the day's fighting fading into the low hum of restored defense systems. Grace called out from the ship's ramp, warning that their departure window was narrowing, but Ayeth held up a hand, silently insisting they wait for Laura's return, regardless of the schedule. Minutes stretched long and tense before Laura reappeared, moving quickly across the open ground toward them, a small data drive clutched tightly in one hand. Her expression had changed since she left, the earlier hesitation replaced by something closer to alarm. I found more than I expected, she said, breathless from hurrying. The request did not come from standard deployment channels at all. It was flagged under something called custodian clearance, a designation I have never seen used for routine personnel checks. Whoever pulled your file wanted information most departments are not even permitted to know exists. Mark took the small drive from her outstretched hand, its weight negligible compared to the heaviness settling over his thoughts. Custodian clearance meant nothing to him yet, but the word itself carried an unsettling formality, the kind reserved for something far more organized than a single curious officer acting alone. As Laura hurried off toward the colony's data terminal to return to her repairs, Mark exchanged a wordless glance with Ayeth, both of them sensing that whatever waited inside that record was about to unravel every assumption he had made about the accident that had brought him here. The exhausted relief of surviving his first real battle faded quickly, replaced by a colder, more urgent question that settled deep into his chest. If someone had requested his personal records before anyone even knew this attack was coming, then perhaps nothing about his arrival in this war had ever truly been an accident at all. The ship had barely cleared the moon's atmosphere before Mark plugged the small data drive into a reader in the crew quarters, his hands trembling slightly as lines of unfamiliar text scrolled across the screen. Most of it meant nothing to him, dense strings of coalition code and administrative language he had no context to understand. Ayeth leaned over his shoulder, her sharp eyes scanning the same information far faster than his could follow. "This is a personnel flag," she said finally, pointing to a repeating symbol near the top of each entry. "Custodian branch. I recognize the seal, though I have never worked directly under their authority. They operate separately from standard command structures, answering to almost no one within the regular coalition chain." Nathan, sitting across the small room, leaned forward with a frown. "What do they actually do?" he asked. "I have heard the name before, always in passing, always followed by someone changing the subject quickly." Ayeth was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words with obvious care. "Officially, the custodians oversee long-term strategic planning for the coalition," she said. "Unofficially, soldiers talk. Rumors describe them as the branch responsible for identifying new resources before a crisis makes them necessary. New territories, new materials, new sources of manpower." The word manpower settled heavily in the small room, and Mark felt his stomach tighten as the pieces began arranging themselves into an uncomfortable shape. "New sources of manpower," he repeated slowly. "Like recruiting an entire planet nobody even knows is part of this war yet." Ayeth did not answer immediately, but her silence was answer enough. She turned back to the screen, scrolling further down through the data Laura had managed to extract, until a new section appeared, formatted differently from the rest, filled with graphs and projections rather than simple text records. Mark leaned closer, squinting at labels he slowly began to piece together despite the unfamiliar formatting. Population Viability Assessment, one heading read, followed by a string of figures Mark recognized with a jolt as belonging unmistakably to Earth. Estimated combat aptitude across sampled demographics. Recommended enlistment pace. Projected coalition benefit versus projected local disruption. Mark stared at the screen, his throat tightening as the full scope of what he was looking at began to settle over him. "This is not about me being chosen randomly because I happen to be useful," he said quietly. "This is an entire planet being evaluated like some kind of resource waiting to be measured and used." Ayeth's expression had grown grim, her earlier caution replaced by something closer to genuine concern. "If this assessment is accurate," she said, "then the recent increase in human enlistments is not coincidence at all. It is the early stage of something larger, a test to determine whether your world could serve as what the document calls a reserve force, without your people ever being formally told a war exists." The ship's crew quarters felt suddenly smaller, the hum of the engines louder against the heavy silence that followed. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head slowly. "A whole planet turned into spare soldiers," he muttered, "and nobody back home would even know it was happening, until it was too late to say no." Mark thought of his mother, still waiting for a phone call that would never come, of his friends who had likely reported him missing weeks ago by now, of an entire world going about its ordinary life, while something far above their understanding quietly decided their fate without ever asking permission. The unfairness of it settled into anger, sharp and clarifying, cutting through the fear that had followed him since the night the beacon first marked him as enlisted. "We need to find out how far this has gone already," Mark said, surprising himself with the steadiness in his own voice. "If this is really happening, people back home deserve to know before it goes any further." Ayeth studied him carefully, weighing something behind her golden eyes before finally speaking. "That is a dangerous path," she warned. "The custodians do not tolerate interference with their planning, especially not from a recently enlisted recruit who was never meant to see this information at all. If they learn you have accessed this record, they will not simply ask you politely to forget it." Despite the warning, something in Mark had already shifted past the point of turning back. "I did not ask to be pulled into this war," he said, "but now that I am here, I am not going to pretend I never saw this, whatever it costs." Over the following days, as the ship carried them back toward the Coalition's main command station, Ayeth quietly reached out to contacts she trusted from earlier postings, careful never to mention Mark's name directly over any channel that might be monitored. Piece by piece, a clearer picture began forming. The custodian branch operated out of a heavily restricted facility, known only by a designation number, staffed by a small, tightly controlled group answering to a single director whose name appeared nowhere in standard Coalition records, only referenced obliquely as Director Cross. A former colleague of Ayeth's, an older alien officer named Owen Marsh who had transferred out of frontline duty years earlier, agreed to meet them briefly during a supply stop at a busy trade station orbiting a distant gas giant. Owen's cautious, worn expression suggested he understood exactly how much risk he was taking simply by agreeing to talk. "I worked adjacent to their facility for almost a year before requesting transfer," Owen admitted quietly, glancing frequently toward the crowded station corridor around them. "What I saw convinced me I did not want to know more than I already did. They do not just study populations from a distance. They run direct field tests, small-scale operations, designed to measure how quickly a newly enlisted candidate adapts, how their presence affects unit performance in combat. Everything is recorded. Everything is measured." Mark felt a cold chill settle over him as Owen's words connected directly to his own experience, to the careful way his early stumbles had been noted, to the small approving nod Ayeth had given him after his first successful simulation, wondering now whether even that moment had somehow been part of a test he never knew he was taking. "Am I still being watched right now?" Mark asked quietly. Owen's expression turned grave. "If your name is flagged under custodian clearance," he said, "then almost certainly yes, in some form. Not constant surveillance, that would draw too much attention even from other Coalition branches, but enough that your movements, your performance, your choices, all of it likely feeds back into their assessment eventually." The trade station's crowded corridor suddenly felt far less anonymous than it had a moment earlier, every passing stranger now carrying the faint possibility of being more than they appeared. Ayeth thanked Owen quietly, and the older officer disappeared back into the crowd without another word, clearly eager to distance himself from the conversation as quickly as possible. As they made their way back toward their own docked ship, Ith's communicator chimed with an incoming priority message, the kind reserved for urgent coalition business, rather than routine updates. She read it in silence, her expression shifting from careful neutrality into something sharper, more alarmed, as her eyes moved down the screen. "What is it?" Mark asked, dread already curling through his chest before she answered. "A retrieval order," Ith said quietly, turning the screen so he could see the flag designation at the top of the message, the same custodian seal from the data record, burned now into Mark's memory. "Issued directly under Director Cross's authority. It requests your immediate transfer into custodian custody, effective the moment this ship docks at the main station." Mark's stomach dropped, the crowded, ordinary bustle of the trade station suddenly feeling like the last calm moment before something far more dangerous closed in around him. "They know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They know I saw the file." Ith's jaw tightened, her golden eyes hardening with quiet, controlled resolve. "Then we do not dock at the main station," she said firmly. "Not yet. Whatever the custodians intend for you, we are not simply handing you over without understanding exactly what we would be handing you into." They hurried back to the ship, where Grace was already running pre-departure checks, humming quietly to herself, entirely unaware of the message that had just changed everything. Ith explained the situation quickly, her words clipped and efficient, and Mark watched the calm routine of the ship dissolve into something far more urgent. Grace's humming stopped mid-note, replaced by a series of rapid keystrokes as she pulled up alternate flight paths on her display. "If we skip the main station," she said, "we lose our scheduled resupply window. We also lose the cover of docking alongside a dozen other squads, which usually keeps anyone from paying too much attention to a single ship coming and going." Kate, arriving just behind them with Simon close at her side, caught the tail end of the conversation and immediately understood the stakes, without needing further explanation. She had spent 2 years learning how quickly coalition politics could turn dangerous for anyone caught on the wrong side of an internal dispute, and her expression hardened with the particular calm of someone who had faced worse odds before. "We are not leaving him behind," she said simply, glancing at Mark before anyone else could speak. "Whatever this custodian branch wants him for, it is clearly not something good, or they would not need a retrieval order at all. They would just ask." Simon nodded in firm agreement, already moving toward the ship's small weapons locker to check their remaining supplies. Nathan, standing near the doorway, looked more shaken than the others, his own history with the beacon clearly weighing heavily on him as he processed what Owen's warning might mean for his own past as well. "If they are running tests on newly enlisted humans," he said slowly, "then this has probably been happening to me too, this whole time, and I never even noticed." He turned to Mark, something raw and unguarded crossing his face. "We stop this together, or it just keeps happening to whoever comes after us." The squad's unanimous decision settled something steady into Mark's chest, a fragile but real sense that he was no longer facing this alone. Whatever mistakes had brought him into this war, whatever plan the custodians had quietly built around candidates like him, he now had people willing to stand beside him, rather than simply following orders to hand him over. Grace charted a longer, less direct route toward a smaller relay station on the edge of coalition territory, one rarely monitored closely enough to draw attention from higher command. The ship pulled away from the crowded trade station, just as another vessel, sleek and unmarked except for a small emblem matching the custodian seal from Ith's message, began approaching from the opposite docking ring. Mark watched it through the rear viewport until it shrank into the surrounding traffic, uncertain whether its presence was coincidence or the first visible sign that the retrieval order was already being acted upon. Throughout the following 2 days of travel, the ship's mood remained tense but resolute, every member of the squad quietly preparing for a confrontation none of them could fully predict. Ith spent long hours reviewing what little additional information Owen had managed to pass along before they parted ways, cross-referencing old service records and half-remembered rumors, in an attempt to understand exactly what resources the custodian branch might bring to bear if their retrieval order was ignored for long. "They will not send an entire fleet after one recruit," she said during one such session, thinking aloud more than explaining directly to Mark. "That would draw far too much attention from other coalition branches who already view the custodians with suspicion. More likely, they will send a small, discreet team, skilled enough to handle the situation quietly before anyone outside their own ranks realizes what has happened. Mark absorbed this information with a strange, steady calm that surprised him, the same instinctive focus that had carried him through his first real battle, now settling over the far less familiar danger of being hunted by his own supposed allies. Whatever came next, he intended to face it with the same stubborn refusal, to simply accept what he was told, the same quality that had apparently made him valuable enough to the custodians in the first place. As their ship approached the quiet relay station on the edge of Coalition space, Grace's sensors picked up a small, unmarked vessel, already docked at one of the outer berths, its configuration matching nothing in the station's public registry. Ayeth studied the readings with narrowed eyes, her earlier calm giving way to something far more alert. "That is not a coincidence," she said quietly. "They already know where we are headed." Grace pulled the ship into a slow, cautious approach, keeping distance from the unmarked vessel while she scanned the relay station for any other signs of movement. The station itself looked ordinary enough, a modest ring of docking berths surrounding a central hub that handled fuel and supply exchanges for smaller Coalition outposts. Yet the presence of that single unmarked ship sitting quietly at berth 6 told Mark everything he needed to know about how ordinary this stop was actually going to be. Ayeth gathered the squad in the cargo bay before they docked, her voice low and steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "Whoever is waiting on that station came prepared," she said. "We do not know their numbers or their intentions beyond the retrieval order itself. I want no unnecessary confrontation. If there is a way to resolve this without conflict, we take it. But if they attempt to remove Mark by force, we do not simply stand aside." Kate checked her weapon with practiced calm, while Simon exchanged a quick glance with Nathan, both of them settling into the same focused readiness Mark had come to recognize from the battle on the mining colony. Mark himself felt his pulse quicken, not from fear alone this time, but from a fierce determination that had been building steadily since the moment he first read the word manpower, attached to his own planet's name. The ship docked with a soft mechanical clunk, and the cargo bay doors slid open onto the quiet, dimly lit corridor of the relay station. Waiting just beyond the doorway stood a tall, composed man in a dark uniform unlike anything Mark had seen among the Coalition's regular forces, its fabric a deep charcoal color, free of any unit markings except for a small silver emblem pinned near the collar. Two similarly dressed figures flanked him, standing with the same rigid stillness of people trained to remain perfectly calm no matter the circumstances. The man in front introduced himself simply as Agent Victor Hale, his voice pleasant and measured in a way that somehow made the words feel more unsettling rather than less. "I believe you already received our request," he said, addressing Ayeth directly, while his eyes flicked briefly toward Mark. "I am here to make the transfer simple for everyone involved." Ayeth stood her ground at the top of the ramp, her expression carefully neutral. "Before any transfer takes place," she said, "I would like to understand exactly what purpose it serves. My squad member was enlisted through standard beacon procedure. I see no listed cause for a custodian retrieval order attached to his file." Victor's pleasant expression did not waver, though something colder flickered briefly behind his eyes. "Custodian operations do not require field officers to understand every listed cause," he said smoothly. "I would remind you that interference with an active retrieval order carries significant consequences, regardless of rank or unit standing." Mark felt the weight of every eye in the corridor shift toward him, and he stepped forward before he had fully decided to speak, his voice steadier than he expected given how hard his heart was pounding. "I have seen the population assessment file," he said clearly. "I know what the custodians are actually testing for. If you want to take me quietly, you are going to have to explain to my squad, and eventually, to a lot more people than that, exactly why an entire planet is being measured for use in a war it was never told about." A flicker of genuine surprise crossed Victor's composed features before he smoothed it away, though not quickly enough to hide it completely. "That information was never meant to leave secured channels," he said, his tone sharpening slightly at the edges. "Whoever provided it to you violated protocols that carry serious consequences of their own. Nobody provided it to me for the reasons you are assuming," Mark said, refusing to let Laura's name slip into the conversation and put her at further risk. "I read it because I earned the right to know why I was pulled out of my own life without warning. That is not a violation. That is the bare minimum anyone deserves." The corridor fell into a tense silence, broken only by the faint hum of the station's ventilation system. Victor studied Mark for a long moment, clearly recalculating whatever simple plan he had arrived with. Behind him, the two flanking agents shifted slightly, their hands drifting closer to the weapons secured at their sides, a small motion that did not go unnoticed by Kate and Simon standing just behind Mark on the ramp. "You misunderstand the scope of what you are challenging," Victor said finally, his voice losing some of its earlier smoothness. "The custodian branch does not answer to standard coalition oversight for good reason. Difficult decisions about long-term survival cannot always wait for approval from officials more concerned with public opinion than practical necessity. Your planet is not being harmed. It is being prepared, carefully, gradually, for a threat that will eventually reach it whether anyone approves of our methods or not." "Prepared without ever being asked," Mark shot back, his anger cutting cleanly through the fear that had gripped him only minutes earlier. "That is not preparation. That is a decision made about billions of people who never had a voice in it." Ioth stepped forward then, placing herself firmly between Mark and the three custodian agents, her golden eyes hard and unwavering. "This squad has fought and bled under coalition command since long before any custodian order existed," she said. "We do not recognize an authority that operates through secrecy and quiet manipulation instead of honest oversight. If you intend to take Mark, you will need to go through all of us, and I do not believe that is a conflict your director authorized you to start today." Victor's jaw tightened, his composed mask slipping further as he glanced briefly at his two companions, clearly weighing the cost of escalating a confrontation against an entire armed squad, rather than a single unprotected recruit. Whatever calculation ran through his mind, it settled quickly, and he took a measured step back, his expression cooling into something colder and more distant. "This will not end here," he said quietly, addressing Mark directly one final time. "Director Cross does not simply abandon assessments already this far along. You have bought yourself time, nothing more. Consider carefully what you intend to do with it." Without waiting for a response, Victor turned and walked back down the corridor, his two companions falling into step behind him, disappearing around a bend toward their waiting ship without another word. The tension in the corridor did not fully break until the distant sound of their vessel undocking echoed faintly through the station's hull several minutes later. Kate let out a long breath, lowering her weapon at last, while Simon leaned against the ramp railing, shaking his head slowly. "That went better than I expected," he admitted, though I would like it noted that better still meant one wrong word away from a very different outcome. Nathan placed a steady hand on Mark's shoulder, his earlier troubled expression replaced now by something closer to quiet pride. "You just told a custodian agent to his face that an entire planet deserves better," he said. "I do not think anyone has done that before." Ioth turned to face Mark directly, her expression softening slightly from its earlier hardened resolve. "What Victor said was true," she reminded him gently. "This is not finished. The custodians rarely abandon a plan this far along simply because one recruit refused to comply quietly. But you bought your world time it did not have an hour ago, and that matters more than you may realize right now." Mark looked around at his squad, at Kate's steady calm, Simon's tired humor, Nathan's quiet solidarity, and Ioth's unwavering resolve, and felt something settle inside him that had been missing since the night the beacon first pulled him away from everything familiar. He had not asked for any of this. The sudden uniform, the strange new gravity, the war fought light years from the ordinary life he once knew. But standing here now, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand beside him rather than simply following orders, he understood that his story was no longer only about surviving an accident he never wanted. The ship cleared the relay station without further incident, though every member of the squad remained watchful for several hours afterward, half expecting Victor's vessel to reappear on their sensors at any moment. When it did not, a cautious relief settled slowly over the crew, though no one made the mistake of assuming the danger had fully passed. Ioth spent that evening drafting her coded message with careful precision, choosing each word to avoid drawing attention from anyone monitoring standard coalition channels, while still ensuring the message's meaning would be unmistakable to the right recipients. She addressed it to a small circle of senior officers she trusted from years of prior service, individuals known for valuing honest oversight over quiet convenience, people who might have both the authority and the will to question a branch as insulated as the custodians. If even one of them takes this seriously, she explained to Mark as she worked, it forces the conversation into the open. The custodians rely on secrecy to operate the way they do. Expose enough of it to the right people, and quiet plans become much harder to continue without consequence. Mark watched her work, grateful beyond words for a skill and patience he did not possess himself, yet increasingly aware that the message alone might not be enough. What happens if nobody with real authority believes it? He asked. What happens if Director Cross simply denies everything and buries the file even deeper than before? Ayeth paused, considering the question seriously rather than offering empty reassurance. Then we keep gathering evidence, she said. We keep surviving long enough to make the truth harder to ignore each time it resurfaces. This will not be resolved in a single message or a single confrontation at a relay station. It may take far longer than either of us would like. But truth rarely disappears, simply because someone powerful wishes it would. Over the following days, the ship settled into a quieter, more watchful rhythm as it made its way toward a small, independent outpost far outside standard coalition patrol routes, a place Ayeth trusted to offer temporary safety, while her message made its slow way through careful, trusted channels. Kate used the downtime to check the ship's systems more thoroughly than usual, insisting that a single vulnerability in their engines or shields could undo every bit of caution they had shown so far. Simon, in contrast, seemed determined to keep the mood from growing too heavy, filling quiet meals with stories from his years in the unit, some clearly exaggerated for effect, drawing tired but genuine laughter from a crew that badly needed it. Nathan spent much of his free time with Mark, the two of them comparing notes on their strange, parallel journeys from ordinary lives on Earth into a war neither of them had chosen. Nathan admitted that learning the truth behind their recruitment had changed something fundamental in how he viewed his own service, shifting his sense of duty away from blind obedience toward something closer to responsibility, a determination to make sure whatever happened to him and Mark did not simply repeat itself endlessly, with future candidates pulled from unsuspecting towns and cities back home. We cannot save everyone who might get taken next, Nathan admitted one evening, staring out at the passing stars. But we can make sure the people with the power to stop it cannot pretend they never knew. Mark found comfort in those words, even as the uncertainty of what still lay ahead pressed constantly at the edges of his thoughts. He thought often of his mother, of his friends waiting uselessly by that car on the night everything changed, of an entire planet continuing its ordinary rhythms without any idea how close it had already drifted toward becoming a quiet resource in someone else's war. The unfairness of it had not faded, but it had settled into something steadier now, less a source of despair and more of fuel driving him forward. When the ship finally reached the small outpost Ayeth had chosen, a modest trading post built into the hollowed interior of a slow-moving asteroid, the crew allowed themselves their first real rest since the mining colony's attack days earlier. Mark stood at the edge of the outpost's narrow observation deck that evening, watching distant lights flicker across the asteroid's uneven surface, and felt Ayeth step up quietly beside him. "Word will travel slowly from here," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "It may be weeks before we learn whether the message reached anyone willing to act on it. Rest while you can. Whatever comes next will demand everything you have left to give, just as everything so far has." Mark nodded, understanding now in a way he could not have on that first confusing night, just how much truth lived inside her simple, steady advice. Somewhere far beyond them, Earth continued spinning through its ordinary days, entirely unaware of how close it had already come to being quietly claimed as a resource in a war it had never chosen to join. Mark did not know exactly what waited for him next, whether Director Cross would send a larger force, whether the Coalition's higher command would even believe the truth once Ayeth's message reached them, or whether he would ever find a way back to the life he had left behind on that stormy night. But he knew, with a certainty that steadied every uneasy thought still circling his mind, that he would not stop searching for the truth now that he had glimpsed it, and he would not let his world be claimed in silence while he still had breath and a voice to speak against it. The ship pushed forward into the dark, carrying him further from everything familiar and closer to whatever fight still waited ahead. And for the first time since the night the beacon marked him without his consent, Mark Hensley felt something steady beneath the fear. Not certainty that he would win, only certainty that he would not stop trying, whatever the custodian sent for him next.